In this video, we'll be talking about rates of change. In real life, there are often two quantities that are related in some way. For example, when you turn your oven on to preheat it, two relevant quantities are the amount of time that has passed since you turned your oven on and the temperature inside the oven. As time passes, the oven gets hotter. A rate of change, or just rate for short, is a measure of how one quantity changes as the other changes. In our example, a rate would tell us how the temperature changes as the time increases. So this rate may be something like 20 degrees per minute, meaning every minute that passes, the temperature increases by 20 degrees. Rates are very useful numbers to know, and it is a large part of what you'll be learning about in calculus. Let me give you some more examples of rates that you might come across in your everyday life. One example of a rate is an hourly wage when you're working a job. Usually, hourly wages are expressed in terms of dollars per hour. The two relevant quantities here are the amount of money that you're paid and the number of hours that you work. The hourly wage tells you how your pay increases as time passes. Suppose that you are paid $150 for working 8 hours. Let's try to determine our hourly wage. To calculate our hourly wage, all we have to do is take the amount that we're paid and divide it by the time that we worked. So we can plug in $150 that we got paid divided by the 8 hours that you worked. And this gives us $18.75 per hour, meaning every hour that we work, our pay increases by $18.75. Another example of a rate is your speed when you're driving a car. Speed is usually measured in terms of miles per hour. So our relevant quantities here are distance and time. So our rate here tells us how distance changes as time passes. Let's consider this example where we drove 240 miles in 4 hours. Let's try to calculate our speed. Just like before, we can calculate this rate by dividing the two quantities. Take the distance traveled and divide it by the amount of time it took. So in our example here, we traveled 240 miles, and we're going to divide that by the 4 hours that it took. This gives us 60 miles per hour. Another example of a rate that is related to cars is a car's fuel efficiency. A car's fuel efficiency is usually measured in terms of miles per gallon. So the relevant quantities here are the amount of distance you can travel and the amount of gas it takes. So our rate here would tell us how much more distance we can travel if we increase the amount of gas that we use. As an example, suppose that we drove 200 miles using 6 gallons of gas. Let's try to calculate our fuel efficiency. Just like our previous examples, if we want to calculate this rate, all we have to do is divide our two quantities. We take the distance traveled and we divide by the amount of gas it takes. So in this example, we have 200 miles that we drove, and we're going to divide that by the 6 gallons of gas that it took. 200 divided by 6 gives us about 33.3 miles per gallon. So this rate here tells us that we can travel about 33.3 miles for each gallon of gas that we have. Our last example of a rate that you might come across is your pulse. When you go to a doctor's office, your pulse is usually measured in terms of beats per minute. So the relevant quantities here are the number of heartbeats and time. This rate tells us how many times our heart will beat as time passes. Suppose that your heart beat 35 times in 30 seconds. Let's try to calculate our pulse. Again, to calculate this rate, all we have to do is divide our two relevant quantities. We're going to take the number of heartbeats and divide it by the amount of time it took. So in this situation, we have 35 heartbeats. Now, since pulse is usually measured in terms of beats per minute, let's write down our time in terms of minutes rather than seconds. So we're going to divide this by 30 seconds is half a minute, so 0.5 minutes. So doing 35 divided by 0.5, we get 70 beats per minute. This rate tells us that every minute that passes, our heart will beat 70 times. In this video, we learned about rates of change, which is a measure of how one quantity changes as another changes. And we looked at some real-life examples of rates. In our next video, we'll go into more details about rates and also look at what rates mean on graphs.